You're standing on a dusty main street where silence has replaced the sounds of life. Weathered wooden buildings line the road, their windows empty like hollow eyes staring back at you. A rusted sign creaks gently in the wind, advertising goods that haven't been sold in decades. This was once someone's home, someone's dream, someone's entire world. Now it exists only as a monument to impermanence, a place where time stopped but never really ended. Did you know there are an estimated 3,800 ghost towns scattered across the American landscape alone? Or that some abandoned cities are being slowly swallowed by deserts, their buildings filled with sand dunes instead of people? Tonight on Midnight Deep Dive, we're exploring the haunting world of ghost towns and abandoned cities. Places where ordinary life came to an extraordinary end. So settle in, slow your breathing, and let yourself drift peacefully as we wander through empty streets and silent buildings. The American West in the mid-1800s was gripped by a fever unlike anything the world had seen before. News of gold discovered in California streams spread like wildfire, transforming ordinary people into prospectors overnight. Men abandoned their families, farmers left their fields, and entire communities packed up and headed west with nothing but hope and determination. Where gold or silver was discovered, towns sprang up almost overnight. Canvas tents giving way to wooden buildings, saloons opening before churches, and populations swelling from 0 to thousands in a matter of months. Bodie, California, represents perhaps the quintessential gold rush ghost town. In 1876, Bodie was barely a blip on the map, a struggling mining camp with a handful of hardy souls willing to endure the brutal winters at 8,400 feet elevation. Then came the discovery of a particularly rich vein of gold, and everything changed. Within 3 years, Bodie's population exploded to nearly 10,000 people. The town boasted 65 saloons, numerous brothels, gambling halls, opium dens, and even a Chinatown complete with a Taoist temple. The main street stretched for nearly a mile, lined with brick buildings and wooden storefronts, their false fronts reaching toward the sky in architectural optimism. Life in Bodie was rough and violent. The town earned a reputation as one of the wildest in the West, with shootings and brawls occurring with such frequency that a young girl, upon learning her family was moving to Bodie, reportedly wrote in her diary, "Goodbye God, I'm going to Bodie." Whether this was exactly what she wrote or a sanitized version of "Goodbye God, I'm going to Bodie" remains debated, but the sentiment captures the town's dangerous character perfectly. The miners themselves worked in conditions that would horrify modern safety inspectors. They descended into the earth through narrow shafts, working by candlelight in tunnels that could collapse at any moment. The temperature underground varied wildly. Frigid cold near the surface, oppressive heat as they went deeper. Cave-ins, explosions from blasting, and toxic gases claimed lives regularly. Above ground, the stamping mills that crushed ore operated around the clock, their thunderous pounding echoing through the surrounding hills like the heartbeat of industry itself. But Bodie's prosperity contained the seeds of its own demise. By the late 1880s, the richest veins had been exhausted. 2 devastating fires in 1892 and 1932 destroyed much of the town's business district, including the mills that processed ore. As profits declined, people began leaving. Families packed their belongings and moved to more promising locations. Businesses closed their doors. The saloons fell silent. By 1915, the population had dwindled to fewer than 1,000 people. The final nail in Bodie's coffin came in 1942, when a fire destroyed much of what remained. And wartime priorities meant there were no resources for rebuilding. Today, Bodie exists in what California State Parks calls arrested decay. The approximately 200 remaining buildings are maintained exactly as they appear, weathered, worn, but not restored. Walking through Bodie feels like stepping through a portal into 1880. Inside the buildings, tables are still set with dishes, bars display dusty bottles, and a schoolhouse contains desks with lessons still written on the chalkboard. It's as if everyone simply stood up one day and walked away, leaving their lives behind. Montana's Bannack tells a similar story with its own unique twist. Founded in 1862, after gold was discovered in Grasshopper Creek, Bannack became Montana's first territorial capital. The town grew rapidly, and for a brief moment it seemed destined for greatness. But Bannack had a problem. It was led by a corrupt sheriff named Henry Plummer, who secretly ran a gang of road agents called the Innocents. This gang robbed and murdered miners, stole gold shipments, and terrorized the region. When vigilantes finally uncovered the truth, they hanged Plummer and many of his associates from the very gallows he had built for others. The hangings took place on a cold January night in 1864, marking one of the West's most dramatic tales of frontier justice. Despite ridding itself of the Plummer gang, Bannack's gold deposits proved less abundant than hoped. When richer strikes were made elsewhere, people left. By 1970, Bannack was completely abandoned. Today, it's preserved as a state park where over 60 structures remain standing, including Skinner's Saloon, the Mead Hotel, and numerous homes that once housed families dreaming of fortune. Colorado holds the distinction of having more than 700 ghost towns within its borders, more than any other state. The landscape is dotted with remnants of mining camps, each with its own story of boom and bust. St. Elmo, nestled high in the Rockies at over 10,000 feet elevation, was once home to 2,000 people and served as a supply hub for nearby mines. The town had multiple hotels, saloons, a telegraph office, and a general store. Winter snows sometimes reached 20 feet deep, isolating the town for months at a time. The people who stayed through those brutal winters were either remarkably determined or had nowhere else to go. Nevada's Rhyolite presents an even more dramatic story of rapid rise and fall. Founded in 1905 after a prospector discovered high-grade gold ore, Rhyolite grew at an astonishing pace. Within 2 years, the town had electric lights, a stock exchange, an opera house, and a train station with 3 rail lines. The population reached 5,000 to 10,000, and investors poured millions into infrastructure, convinced Rhyolite would become a major city. Some buildings were constructed from thousands of beer bottles. Creative recycling, born from the fact that bottles were more abundant than traditional building materials in the remote desert location. But Rhyolite's glory days lasted barely a decade. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake caused a financial panic that made raising mining capital nearly impossible. Then, a 1907 financial crisis struck. By 1908, the mine operators realized the gold deposits weren't as extensive as initially believed. The population crashed. By 1920, Rhyolite's official population was exactly 0. Today, its ruins stand as a stark reminder of speculative excess and the dangers of building dreams on uncertain foundations. The skeletal remains of the 3-story bank building and the partially standing Cook Bank building create an eerie silhouette against the desert sky. What's fascinating about these gold and silver rush ghost towns is how quickly they cycled through birth, life, and death. Most existed for less than 30 years. They represented humanity's eternal optimism, the belief that this place, this mine, this claim would be the one that made everything worthwhile. Thousands of people bet their futures on these remote, harsh locations. Some struck it rich, most didn't. But for a brief, shining moment, these towns were centers of commerce, culture, and community. While gold rush towns were born from individual prospectors seeking fortune, company towns represented a different model. Communities built entirely by corporations to house workers for specific industrial purposes. These settlements were carefully planned, completely controlled, and wholly dependent on a single employer. When that employer left or the resource was exhausted, entire communities could vanish almost overnight. Perhaps no abandoned industrial site captures the imagination quite like Hashima Island off the coast of Japan. From a distance, the island's silhouette resembles a massive battleship, earning it the nickname Gunkanjima, or Battleship Island. But approach closer and the truth reveals itself. This is no warship, but rather the remains of an incredibly dense urban environment built entirely around coal mining. Hashima's story begins in 1810 when coal was discovered on the small island. For decades, mining operations remained relatively modest. Then, in 1890, Mitsubishi Corporation purchased the island and transformed it into an industrial powerhouse. They built Japan's first large concrete buildings there, massive apartment blocks that could withstand the typhoons that regularly battered the coast. These structures, 9 stories tall, were architectural marvels for their time, built with reinforced concrete decades before such construction became common. At its peak in 1959, Hashima Island housed over 5,000 people on a space barely larger than a football field, making it one of the most densely populated places on Earth. The island was essentially a small city stacked vertically. The apartment buildings included stores, communal baths, a school, a hospital, and even a movie theater. Residents lived their entire lives without ever needing to leave the island. Children were born in the island's hospital, attended school on the island, and some eventually went to work in the same mines as their fathers. Life on Hashima was hard despite the modern amenities. Miners worked in sweltering conditions deep beneath the seafloor, extracting coal from tunnels that extended far beyond the island's boundaries. The work was dangerous, with cave-ins, flooding, and gas explosions claiming lives regularly. Above ground, the island's residents dealt with limited space, no greenery, and the constant smell of industry. Fresh water had to be brought in by boat until an underwater pipe was constructed from the mainland. The end came suddenly. In the 1960s, Japan shifted from coal to petroleum as its primary energy source. The coal mines became economically unviable. In 1974, Mitsubishi announced the mine's closure. Within months, the entire population evacuated. The last residents turned off their lights, locked their doors, and boarded boats to the mainland, leaving behind a fully functioning city frozen in time. For decades, Hashima remained completely off-limits, slowly deteriorating in the harsh marine environment. Today, limited tours allow visitors to walk through a small portion of Hashima, though most of the island remains too dangerous to enter. The concrete buildings are crumbling, their walls stained with salt and rust. Windows gape like missing teeth. Stairwells lead to nowhere. Inside the accessible buildings, visitors can see personal belongings, old newspapers, and the detritus of daily life abandoned in haste. The island has become a meditation on industrial ambition and the expendability of communities built solely for profit. Halfway around the world, Pennsylvania's Centralia presents a different type of industrial ghost town. One abandoned not because the resource was depleted, but because the very ground became uninhabitable. Centralia was a typical small Pennsylvania coal mining town, home to about 1,000 people in its heyday. The coal seams beneath the town had made it prosperous since the 1860s. But in 1962, something went terribly wrong. The exact cause remains debated, but most accounts suggest that a fire started in a landfill that had been placed in an abandoned mine pit. The fire spread into the coal seam beneath the town and proved impossible to extinguish. Coal seam fires are notoriously difficult to stop. The coal underground can burn for decades or even centuries, smoldering beneath the surface like some underground dragon. At first, Centralia's residents didn't realize the severity of the problem, but as years passed, the effects became impossible to ignore. The ground grew hot enough to melt shoe soles. Cracks appeared in streets, releasing toxic gases and smoke. Basements filled with carbon monoxide. In 1981, A 12-year-old boy nearly died when a sinkhole opened beneath him, dropping him into a pit of toxic fumes. Only his cousin's quick action saved his life. The government eventually declared Centralia uninhabitable. Most residents accepted buyouts and relocated. The Postal Service revoked the town's zip code. Route 61, the main highway through town, was officially closed when the heat buckled it beyond repair, though it has since become a popular destination for urban explorers who cover it with graffiti. Today, only a handful of residents remain, stubbornly refusing to leave their homes despite the fire still burning beneath their feet. Scientists estimate the underground fire has enough coal to burn for another 250 years. Walking through Centralia today is surreal. Most houses have been demolished, leaving behind only their foundations and front steps leading to nowhere. The few remaining buildings look like artifacts from another era, surrounded by empty lots where neighbors once lived. Smoke occasionally rises from cracks in the earth. The infamous graffiti-covered stretch of abandoned highway, once known as the Graffiti Highway, has become a canvas for thousands of visitors, though local officials have recently tried to discourage tourism by covering portions with dirt. In the Arctic Circle, the abandoned Soviet town of Pripyat presents yet another variation on the company town theme. Built by the Soviet Union on the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, Pripyat was a coal mining settlement that operated from 1910 until its abandonment in 1998. At its peak, about 1,000 people lived there, working the coal mines in one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. Pripyat was designed to showcase Soviet achievement. Unlike most Arctic mining camps, it featured cultural amenities including a swimming pool, library, sports complex, and concert hall. The settlement had a school, a hospital, and even a farm where workers grew vegetables in heated greenhouses. A remarkable achievement considering the location's extreme cold. A statue of Lenin still stands in the central square, his arm raised toward the coal mine as if blessing the workers' efforts. Life in Pripyat was harsh but carefully structured. The Soviet system provided everything: housing, food, entertainment, and work. Residents couldn't simply leave, they were there on contract. During the polar night, when the sun doesn't rise for months, depression and alcoholism became serious problems. Yet the community persevered, driven by Soviet ideology and the promise of good wages. The collapse of the Soviet Union dealt Pripyat a death blow. The mines became economically unviable, and maintaining such a remote settlement proved too expensive for the Russian state company that inherited the operation. In 1998, the last residents departed, leaving everything behind. Unlike most ghost towns that decay over decades, Pripyat's Arctic environment has preserved it in remarkable condition. The cold, dry air prevents rapid deterioration, creating a perfectly preserved Soviet time capsule. Today, Pripyat has found new life as a tourist destination. A small hotel operates in one of the former residential buildings, and guided tours take visitors through this remarkably intact abandoned town. Walking through Pripyat feels like exploring a Soviet museum, except everything is authentic and in its original location. The theater still has propaganda posters. The gymnasium still has Soviet-era equipment. The cafeteria still has Soviet china in the cabinets. These industrial ghost towns, Hashima, Centralia, Pripyat, represent different paths to abandonment, but they share a common thread. They existed purely to extract resources, and when extraction became impossible or unprofitable, they lost their reason to exist. Unlike towns that grew organically over time, developing diverse economies and communities, company towns were purpose-built machines for resource extraction. When the machine broke or the resource vanished, there was nothing left to sustain human habitation. Not all ghost towns were built around mining or industry. Some were founded on idealism, attempts to create perfect societies utopian communities where people could live according to their highest principles. America's landscape is dotted with the remains of these experimental settlements, places where dreamers tried to build heaven on earth and discovered that paradise is harder to maintain than to imagine. New Harmony, Indiana, has the distinction of hosting not one but two failed utopian experiments. The first settlement was established in 1814 by the Harmony Society, a group of German pietist separatists led by George Rapp. These harmonists believed in communal property, celibacy, and awaiting the imminent return of Christ. They built an impressive town of 180 structures, complete with factories, orchards, and vineyards. The community became economically successful, producing goods they exported throughout America and even to Europe. Life was highly regimented. Work began before dawn, meals were communal, and leisure time was limited. But it worked, at least economically. Then in 1825, Rapp decided to move the community back to Pennsylvania. He sold the entire town, buildings, land, and equipment, to Robert Owen, a Welsh social reformer who had different utopian ideas entirely. Owen envisioned a community based on education, social equality, and cooperative labor rather than religious devotion. He rechristened the settlement New Harmony and invited intellectuals, educators, and reformers to join his experiment in secular perfection. What happened next became a cautionary tale about idealism without practical planning. Owen attracted brilliant minds, scientists, educators, artists. But these intellectuals often proved better at theorizing about cooperative labor than actually performing it. Some residents spent their days reading philosophy, while others did backbreaking farm work. Disagreements erupted about governance, labor distribution, and community rules. Within 2 years, the experiment collapsed. Owen lost most of his considerable fortune. The community splintered into multiple smaller groups, then dissolved entirely. Today, New Harmony is a living town that preserves buildings from both utopian experiments, serving as a monument to humanity's persistent but often frustrated quest for perfection. Fruitlands, Massachusetts, represents perhaps the most spectacular failure of American utopianism. Founded in 1843 by transcendentalist Bronson Alcott, father of Louisa May Alcott, and English reformer Charles Lane, Fruitlands was intended as a consociate family living in perfect harmony with nature and spiritual truth. The community's rules were staggeringly impractical. Members were vegan before the term existed, refusing all animal products including wool, leather, and manure for fertilizing crops. They wouldn't use animals for plowing, meaning all farm work had to be done by hand. They avoided most root vegetables because pulling them from the earth seemed violent. Hot baths were discouraged as too sensual. Cotton clothing was forbidden because it was produced by slave labor, but wool was also forbidden, leaving linen as virtually the only acceptable fabric. Predictably, farming without animals or proper fertilizer in the rocky New England soil proved nearly impossible. The few crops they managed to grow were often left to rot in the fields, while the men went on speaking tour to promote their philosophy. The burden of practical survival fell mainly on Bronson's wife, Abigail, and their 4 daughters. When winter arrived with insufficient food stored, most members fled to more comfortable accommodations. The entire experiment lasted less than 7 months. Louisa May Alcott later wrote a scathing, barely fictionalized account of Fruitlands called Transcendental Wild Oats, exposing the gap between her father's lofty ideals and the harsh reality his family endured. The Oneida community in New York took a radically different approach to utopian living. Founded in 1848 by John Humphrey Noyes, Oneida became famous and infamous for its practice of complex marriage. The community rejected monogamy entirely, instead maintaining that all members were married to all other members. Sexual relations were regulated by committee, and decisions about reproduction were carefully controlled through what Noyes called scientific propagation. Children were raised communally rather than by their biological parents. Despite, or perhaps because of, these unconventional practices, Oneida thrived economically. The community manufactured animal traps and silk thread, generating substantial profits. Members lived in a large communal building called the Mansion House, which still stands today. They held regular evening meetings combining business discussions, entertainment, and a practice called mutual criticism, where individual members were publicly analyzed and critiqued by the group, a process that could be therapeutically helpful or psychologically devastating, depending on one's perspective. The community survived for over 30 years, but external pressure eventually proved too much. Local clergy and newspapers condemned Oneida's sexual practices. When Noyes faced potential legal prosecution, he fled to Canada in 1879. Without his charismatic leadership, complex marriage ended within days. The community reorganized as a joint stock company in 1881, abandoning its utopian experiment but continuing as a successful business. Oneida Limited, which still manufactures silverware and other products today. Llano del Rio, California, represents early 20th century utopian socialism's attempt to create a self-sufficient colony in the Mojave Desert. Founded in 1914 by Job Harriman, a labor lawyer and socialist politician, Llano was conceived as a cooperative commonwealth where residents would share labor and resources equally. At its peak, about 1,100 people lived there, building an impressive infrastructure including a hotel, school, bakery, and even a small newspaper. The colonists constructed an elaborate irrigation system to make the desert bloom, and for a time, it worked. Orchards produced fruit, gardens yielded vegetables, and the community seemed to be proving that cooperative socialism could succeed in America. But water rights disputes with neighboring ranchers created constant legal battles. Internal conflicts arose over governance and labor distribution. Some residents felt others weren't pulling their weight. By 1918, just 4 years after its founding, most colonists had abandoned Llano del Rio. A few diehards moved the community to Louisiana, where it limped along for another 2 decades before final dissolution. Today, scattered ruins remain in the desert. Crumbling foundations, the remains of the stone silos, pieces of the irrigation system. The site is largely forgotten, except by ghost town enthusiasts and historians of American socialism. The ruins speak to noble intentions undermined by practical challenges. Insufficient water, human nature's resistance to pure equality, and the difficulty of sustaining idealism when faced with daily survival needs. What unites all these failed utopias, New Harmony, Fruitlands, Oneida, Llano del Rio, and hundreds of others, is the gap between vision and reality. The founders saw clearly how society should be organized, but implementing those visions required either compromising principles or demanding unsustainable commitment from community members. Economic sustainability proved particularly challenging. Religious communities like the Shakers succeeded longer than secular ones, partly because shared faith provided stronger bonds than shared ideology. But even successful utopian communities rarely lasted beyond their founding generation. Some towns don't die slowly from economic decline or resource depletion. Instead, they're killed suddenly by catastrophic events that force entire populations to flee, sometimes with only minutes of warning. These disaster-struck ghost towns carry a particularly haunting quality. They're frozen at the exact moment catastrophe struck, preserving the rhythm of ordinary life interrupted by extraordinary circumstances. Pripyat, Ukraine, stands as the most famous and tragic example of a town abandoned due to disaster. Built in 1970 to house workers for the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Pripyat was designed as a model Soviet city. By 1986, it had grown to nearly 50,000 residents, mostly young families. The average age was just 26. The city featured apartment blocks, schools, shops, a cultural center, and an amusement park scheduled to open on May 1st for May Day celebrations. Life in Pripyat was considered good by Soviet standards. Power plant workers earned high wages, goods were more available than in many Soviet cities, and the community had a hopeful, forward-looking atmosphere. Then came April 26, 1986, at 1:23 in the morning. Reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl plant exploded during a safety test gone catastrophically wrong. The explosion blew off the reactor's heavy steel and concrete lid and sent a plume of radioactive material into the atmosphere. 400 times more fallout than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Pripyat, located just 3 kilometers from the plant, received massive doses of radiation. Yet for 36 hours, officials told Pripyat's residents nothing. Children played outside, people went to work. Life continued normally while invisible particles of cesium, strontium, and plutonium settled over the city like deadly snow. When the evacuation order finally came on April 27th, officials claimed it would be temporary. Residents were told to take only essential items and that they'd return in 3 days. Buses arrived, and within hours, the entire city was emptied. Those residents never came home. Soviet authorities established an 18-mile exclusion zone around the plant, and Pripyat has remained abandoned ever since. The city became a time capsule of the Soviet 1980s. In the decades since evacuation, nature has begun reclaiming the abandoned structures. Trees grow through apartment balconies. Vines cover playground equipment. The Ferris wheel in the amusement park, which never gave its first ride, has become an iconic symbol of the disaster, its yellow cars slowly rusting against the sky. Inside buildings, radiation warning signs share wall space with Soviet propaganda posters. Schools contain scattered textbooks, children's artwork on walls, and gas masks in piles. Small sizes, meant for children. Walking through Pripyat today requires special permits and radiation monitoring. Tour guides carry dosimeters that click faster in certain areas, indicating radiation hotspots. Some places remain too dangerous to enter. The hospital basement, where firefighters' heavily contaminated clothing was discarded, emits radiation levels that would be lethal with extended exposure. Yet other areas are relatively safe for brief visits. The experience is profoundly unsettling. A city that should be full of life stands silent except for birds and the rustle of leaves. What makes Pripyat particularly tragic is how preventable it was. The disaster resulted from a combination of design flaws, safety violations, and human error. The evacuation delay exposed residents to unnecessary radiation. Many later developed cancers and other health problems. Some first responders and plant workers received fatal doses trying to contain the accident. Pripyat exists as a monument not just to technological failure, but to the human cost of that failure. On the other side of the world, the Italian village of Krakow tells a different disaster story. One of slow-motion catastrophe rather than sudden explosion. Perched dramatically on a hillside in southern Italy, Krakow's history stretches back to 540 AD. For more than a millennium, the village persevered through plagues, invasions, and hardships. Medieval buildings climbed the steep slopes, creating a picturesque settlement that seemed to grow organically from the rock itself. But Krakow was built on unstable ground. The village sits atop clay soils prone to landslides, and over centuries, the hillside gradually shifted. Cracks appeared in building walls. In 1963, a major landslide damaged several structures. Then, in 1972, a severe earthquake struck, rendering most buildings unsafe. Rather than risk collapse, authorities evacuated the approximately 1,800 residents to a new town built in a safer location nearby. Today, Krakow stands as a haunting medieval ghost town. The narrow streets wind between empty stone buildings. Churches with frescoes peeling from their walls stand open to the elements. Windows gape emptily from buildings that tilt at dangerous angles. The hilltop is crowned by the remains of a Norman tower, still watching over the abandoned village below. Unlike disaster sites that become completely off-limits, Krakow has embraced its ghostly status. Guided tours take visitors through safe portions of the village, and the atmospheric ruins have attracted filmmakers. Scenes from The Passion of the Christ and the James Bond film Quantum of Solace were shot among Krakow's atmospheric decay. Krakow reminds us that natural disasters needn't be sudden to be devastating. The slow-motion disaster of unstable geology achieved the same result as Chernobyl's explosion. A once thriving community reduced to empty buildings and echoing streets. In France, the village of Oretter-sur-Glane represents disaster of an entirely different kind. Human evil rather than natural catastrophe or technological failure. On June 10, 1944, this peaceful village in central France went about its ordinary business. It was a Saturday afternoon. Children attended school. People worked in fields and shops. Then at 2 p.m., a company of Waffen-SS soldiers surrounded the village. What happened next remains one of World War II's most horrific massacres of French civilians. The soldiers rounded up Oretter-sur-Glane's residents and separated men from women and children. The men were taken to barns and machine-gunned. The women and children, 642 people in total, were locked in the village church. The soldiers set the church on fire and machine-gunned anyone who tried to escape. When the massacre ended, only a handful of people had survived by playing dead or hiding. The soldiers then burned the entire village. After the war, France's government decided to preserve Oretter-sur-Glane exactly as the Germans left it, as a memorial to the atrocity and a reminder of war's horrors. A new village was built nearby for survivors and returning residents, but the ruins of the old village were maintained. Today, visitors can walk through Oretter-sur-Glane's preserved remains. Rusted cars still sit on streets. The burned-out shell of the church stands as the centerpiece, a memorial inside marking where children died. Houses retain their empty window frames and charred walls. Personal belongings, sewing machines, bicycles, pots and pans, remain where they fell. The preserved village serves as both memorial and warning. Unlike other ghost towns that fascinates through decay and abandonment, Oretter-sur-Glane disturbs through its preserved horror. It forces visitors to confront humanity's capacity for cruelty and the fragility of civilization. The village's silence carries the weight of 642 murdered civilians, a reminder that some ghost towns aren't created by economics or nature, but by our darkest impulses. These disaster-struck ghost towns, Pripyat, Krakow, Oretter-sur-Glane, each frozen at their moment of catastrophe, serve different purposes in our collective memory. Pripyat warns against technological hubris and the dangers of nuclear power mismanaged. Krakow reminds us that humans sometimes build in places nature never intended for permanent habitation. Oretter-sur-Glane stands as an eternal witness to war crimes and a pledge that such atrocities must never be forgotten. Their emptiness speaks louder than any occupied town ever could. Military conflict has created ghost towns throughout history, though the mechanisms vary widely. Some towns are destroyed in fighting, their residents killed or scattered. Others are deliberately emptied to create buffer zones or exclusion areas. Still others become casualties of political changes that make return impossible. These war-created ghost towns carry particular poignancy. They represent not just economic failure or natural disaster, but the human choice to destroy communities. Varosha on the Mediterranean island of Cyprus presents one of modern history's most surreal ghost towns. In the 1970s, Varosha was the jewel of Cyprus tourism, a beach resort district in the city of Famagusta that attracted celebrities and wealthy tourists from around the world. Luxury hotels lined pristine beaches. High-end shops sold designer goods. Elizabeth Taylor, Bridget Bardot, and other luminaries vacationed there. The district's 15,000 residents enjoyed prosperity from the tourist trade, and Varosha's future seemed limitless. Then came August 1974. Following a Greek nationalist coup in Cyprus, Turkey invaded the island, ostensibly to protect the Turkish Cypriot minority. Turkish forces landed on northern Cyprus and advanced rapidly. As fighting approached Famagusta, Varosha's residents fled south, assuming they'd return when the conflict ended. Most left everything behind: clothes in closets, money in cash registers, food in refrigerators. They expected to be gone days, maybe weeks. They've now been gone nearly 50 years. After capturing the area, Turkish military forces sealed off Varosha behind barbed wire and military checkpoints. The official reason was preserving the district as a potential bargaining chip in peace negotiations. Turkey claimed Varosha would be returned to its Greek Cypriot residents once a political settlement was reached. But decades passed with no agreement, and Varosha remained frozen behind its barriers. For decades, Varosha was completely inaccessible except to Turkish military personnel. Intrepid journalists and photographers who breached the fencing described an eerie scene. Luxury hotels with their lobbies still intact, boutiques with 1970s fashions displayed in windows, cars rusting in parking lots, all slowly decaying in the Mediterranean climate. Trees grew through floors. Roofs collapsed. Salt air corroded everything metal. The pristine beaches remained pristine only because no one could access them. The district became known as the ghost town of the living dead, frozen in 1974 but slowly dying. In recent years, Turkey has begun opening portions of Varosha, though the legal status remains disputed and former residents have not been allowed to reclaim their properties. The partial reopening has been controversial, with Greek Cypriots viewing it as Turkey legitimizing its occupation. Walking through the newly accessible areas feels like exploring a time capsule from the 1970s. The architecture, signage, and remaining artifacts all date to that era, creating a disco-era frozen moment overlaid with decades of decay. Afghanistan's Dar-e-Isuf provides a different example of war-created abandonment. This district in northern Afghanistan has repeatedly emptied and refilled as conflict swept through the region. During Soviet occupation in the 1980s, villages were destroyed and residents fled. Some returned after Soviet withdrawal, only to flee again during the Civil War of the 1990s. The cycle repeated when Taliban forces moved through the area, and again during American military operations. Each wave of conflict left more ruins, more damaged infrastructure, more reasons not to return. Some villages in the district have been abandoned and resettled 3 or 4 times, with each iteration seeing fewer returning residents and more permanent abandonment. Syria's civil war has created numerous ghost towns across that country. The ancient city of Malula, where Aramaic, the language of Jesus, was still spoken, was severely damaged in fighting and largely emptied. The district of Yarmouk in Damascus, once home to the largest Palestinian refugee community in Syria, was devastated by fighting and siege, transforming from a densely populated neighborhood into a landscape of rubble and empty buildings. Satellite imagery of Syrian cities shows entire neighborhoods reduced to skeletal remains, their residents scattered to refugee camps across neighboring countries. What makes war-created ghost towns particularly tragic is their preventability. Unlike natural disasters or resource depletion, military conflict results from human decisions. The empty streets of Varosha exist because politicians couldn't reach agreement. The ruins of Syrian towns are consequences of war crimes and strategic decisions. These abandoned places represent not natural cycles or economic forces, but the failure of diplomacy and the triumph of violence over coexistence. Some war ghost towns eventually see residents return. Germany's cities, heavily bombed during World War II, were rebuilt and repopulated. Vietnam's former battlefields have long since returned to normal life, but others remain abandoned decades later, their emptiness perpetuated by ongoing political disputes or the scale of destruction. The ghost towns of Cyprus, the exclusion zones of former Yugoslavia, the depopulated villages of Afghanistan. These places remain caught in political limbo, their residents aging in exile, their children growing up elsewhere, their future uncertain. The ghost towns created by war also serve as memorials and warnings. Oretter-sur-Glane, preserved as France found it after the Nazi massacre, explicitly functions as a memorial to war crimes. The ruins of Hiroshima's Jinbaku Dome, preserved near the atomic bomb hypocenter, warns against nuclear warfare. Varosha's barbed wire-enclosed hotels remind us that political disputes can outlast the buildings they leave empty. These places embody the cost of conflict in ways that statistics and history books cannot. They're physical proof of what war destroys. Walking through war-created ghost towns often reveals the suddenness of departure. Unlike economically declining towns, where people leave gradually over years, war refugees often flee with minutes or hours of warning. The result is spaces frozen mid-activity, meals left on tables, clothes hanging on lines, toys scattered in yards. This sudden abandonment creates particularly haunting atmospheres. You can sense the panic, the desperate hope that departure was temporary, the painful reality that it wasn't. Deserts possess a particular power to erase human presence. The combination of sand, wind, and minimal moisture can transform a bustling town into a partially buried ruin within decades. Nowhere is this more dramatically visible than in Namibia's Kalmanskap, a diamond mining town being slowly swallowed by the Namib Desert. Kalmanskap's story begins in 1908, when a railway worker named Zacharias Luala found a diamond while clearing sand from the tracks. The discovery triggered a diamond rush. German colonial authorities quickly established mining operations, and Kalmanskap was built to house the miners and their families. Unlike most desert mining camps, Kalmanskap was constructed as a proper German town, complete with amenities that would have been impressive even in Germany itself. The town featured a hospital with the first X-ray machine in the southern hemisphere. A ballroom hosted elegant dances where miners in formal wear waltzed with women in European gowns. An incongruous scene in the African desert. A casino provided entertainment. The town had a school, a gymnasium with a bowling alley, a theater, and even a saltwater swimming pool. An ice factory produced ice in a climate where temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees. Kalmanskap was built to German standards, with houses featuring German architectural details that looked utterly out of place in the surrounding dunes. For 2 decades, Kalmanskap prospered. The diamond deposits proved incredibly rich, with stones sometimes found simply lying on the surface. Miners could earn substantial wages, and the German administration ensured a relatively comfortable lifestyle. The town even had a tram system connecting different areas, a luxury that most African towns lacked. But diamond deposits are finite, and by the 1930s, richer fields were discovered south at Oranjemund. As mining operations shifted, Kalmanskap's population declined. By 1954, the last residents had departed, and the desert immediately began its work of reclamation. Sand crept into buildings through broken windows and doors. Dunes formed against walls. Wind carried more sand, gradually filling rooms from floor to ceiling. Today, Kalmanskap is one of Africa's most photographed ghost towns. The sight of abandoned houses filled with sand dunes creates surreal, otherworldly scenes. In some rooms, sand reaches halfway up the walls, creating smooth slopes that contrast with the straight lines of German architecture. Pastel paint peels from walls in artistic patterns. Light streams through broken windows, illuminating the sand in golden hues. The effect is simultaneously beautiful and melancholy, nature patiently, but inexorably erasing human ambition. Visiting Kalmanskap requires joining official tour, as the site is still technically within the diamond mining restricted area. Photographers flock to the ghost town, drawn by the unique visual aesthetic of sand-invaded interiors. The images they capture have become iconic representations of abandonment and decay. But walking through Kalmanskap also provokes contemplation about temporary versus permanent, about human presumption in building elaborate structures in environments hostile to habitation. Egypt's ancient cities provide even more dramatic examples of desert reclamation over longer timescales. The city of Tanis, once a capital of ancient Egypt, gradually disappeared beneath sand after its abandonment. For centuries, its location was uncertain, known only from ancient texts and the Bible. Not until the late 19th century did archaeologists rediscover Tanis, buried under massive sand dunes. Excavation revealed temples, royal tombs, and an entire urban center that sand had preserved for over 2,000 years. These desert ghost towns remind us of nature's patient power. The desert doesn't fight human presence dramatically through earthquakes or floods. Instead, it simply waits. Wind carries sand grain by grain, dunes shift incrementally. Over time, buildings are covered, roads disappear, and all traces of human activity vanish beneath the sand. In Kalmanskap, this process is visible within a human lifetime. The sand is winning, and eventually, the town will disappear entirely. The aesthetic appeal of desert ghost towns has made them popular filming locations and tourist destinations. But this popularity comes with challenges. Increased foot traffic accelerates deterioration. Vandalism damages structures. Some sites struggle to balance preservation with access. Kalmanskap's management allows only guided tour to minimize damage, but even controlled access contributes to wear. Desert ghost towns also raise questions about preservation. Should we fight the sand, maintaining buildings indefinitely? Or should we let nature take its course, documenting the decay but not preventing it? Most preservation experts lean toward the latter approach, allowing natural processes to continue while recording the changes for posterity. This arrested decay philosophy acknowledges that even ghost towns are temporary, and attempting to freeze them in time fights against natural processes that have their own beauty and meaning. While deserts reclaim abandoned towns through burial, water claims them through drowning and decay. Some ghost towns lie beneath reservoirs, deliberately flooded when dams were constructed. Others were abandoned when water sources failed or became contaminated. Still others succumbed to rising seas, their empty streets now claimed by tides. The American West contains numerous towns drowned beneath reservoirs. When the federal government embarked on massive dam building projects in the mid-20th century, entire communities were sacrificed for hydroelectric power and water supply. Kennett, California, was a thriving copper mining town with hotels, stores, and about 15,000 residents during its boom years. In 1944, Shasta Dam was completed, and the reservoir behind it flooded Kennett entirely. Today, the town lies beneath over 300 feet of water, its buildings dissolved or collapsed, accessible only to scuba divers who occasionally explore the submerged ruins. St. Thomas, Nevada, suffered a similar fate, but with an unexpected resurrection. Founded by Mormon settlers in 1865, St. Thomas prospered as a farming and ranching community. The town had a school, stores, and a close-knit community that seemed destined for longevity. Then came plans for Hoover Dam. The reservoir that would form behind the dam, Lake Mead, would flood St. Thomas entirely. In 1938, the last residents departed, leaving their buildings to the rising waters. For decades, St. Thomas remained submerged, but droughts and increased water usage have lowered Lake Mead's level dramatically in recent years. In 2002, the town's remains began emerging from the water. Today, during low water periods, visitors can walk through St. Thomas's ruins. Foundations, walls, and concrete structures that spent decades underwater. The site has become a popular destination for those fascinated by the ghost town that refuses to stay buried, appearing and disappearing with the reservoir's level. The Great Lakes region contains ghost towns claimed by erosion rather than deliberation. Singapore, Michigan, was a lumber town founded in the 1830s on Lake Michigan's shore. The town prospered during the post-Civil War building boom, with several sawmills processing the region's vast timber resources. But the lumber boom led to complete deforestation of the surrounding area. Without tree roots to hold the soil, massive sand dunes began moving across the landscape. Despite attempts to stabilize the dunes, Singapore was gradually buried beneath sand and its shoreline eroded by Lake Michigan. By 1875, the town was completely abandoned. Today, the site lies beneath both sand dunes and the lake itself, with occasional storms revealing wooden remnants from buildings. Rising sea levels and coastal erosion threaten numerous communities globally. In Alaska, several villages face abandonment due to erosion and flooding exacerbated by climate change. Shishmaref, built on a barrier island, has lost significant land to erosion. The island is literally disappearing beneath residents' feet, with houses falling into the sea. The community has voted to relocate, but faces enormous costs and cultural loss. Other Alaskan villages face similar situations, becoming ghost towns not through economic failure, but through the physical disappearance of the land beneath them. The Atlantic coast of Africa faces similar challenges. In Foz do Cunena, Angola, rising seas have forced abandonment of coastal settlements. Buildings stand partially submerged, their foundations undermined by waves. The communities that once occupied these sites have relocated inland, leaving behind structures that represent both homes and a way of life being claimed by the ocean. Industrial pollution has created ghost towns through water contamination. Pitcher, Oklahoma, was once a prosperous lead in zinc mining town. For decades, mining operations dumped toxic waste into local waterways and created massive piles of mining waste called chat. These waste piles contaminated groundwater with lead and other heavy metals. By the 1990s, soil and water testing revealed contamination so severe that the EPA declared Pitcher one of America's most toxic sites. Children showed elevated lead levels. The entire town was eventually declared uninhabitable. Most residents accepted buyouts and relocated. In 2008, a tornado destroyed much of what remained, and by 2009, Pitcher was officially disincorporated. Today, it stands empty, except for a few holdouts who refuse to leave despite the contamination. These water-related ghost towns, flooded, eroded, contaminated, remind us of water's power over human settlement. We build near water because we need it, but water can also destroy. The towns beneath reservoirs represent calculated sacrifices, communities deliberately drowned for greater good. The eroding coastal villages show nature's indifference to human presence. The contaminated sites reveal how industrial activity can render places uninhabitable for generations. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European physicians routinely prescribed taking the waters to patients suffering from various ailments. Wealthy families would travel to spa towns where natural mineral springs promised healing and rejuvenation. These weren't simple bathhouses. They were elaborate social destinations featuring grand hotels, ornate bathing pavilions, manicured gardens, and sophisticated entertainment. For generations, these spa towns represented the height of refined leisure. Today, many stand abandoned, their opulent architecture slowly crumbling into romantic ruins. The Grand Hotel Wildbad in the Italian Alps once attracted European aristocrats to its thermal baths, which were thought to have healing powers. Built in the 1880s, the hotel expanded from a simple sanatorium into a massive resort complex. The thermal springs were first mentioned in documents from 1586, though coins and ruins from Roman times indicate the healing waters were known as early as the 1st century. For centuries, people traveled difficult mountain roads to reach these springs, believing the mineral-rich water could cure everything from rheumatism to respiratory ailments. The hotel's golden age came in the late 19th century when European aristocracy made it a fashionable destination. Guests dressed in formal evening wear for dinners, attended concerts in the ballroom, and spent hours in the elaborately tiled thermal baths. The water flowed at a constant therapeutic temperature, and the hotel's physicians supervised treatments ranging from mineral baths to drinking prescribed amounts of spring water. The remote mountain location only added to the allure. Wealthy guests could escape urban life while enjoying luxurious accommodations. World War I marked the beginning of the hotel's decline. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 propelled the world into unprecedented conflict, and the era of leisurely aristocratic spa visits ended abruptly. The hotel struggled through the interwar years, was auctioned off in the 1930s, and eventually abandoned. Today, the Grand Hotel Wildbad stands in ruins, accessible only by hiking trails. The grand ballrooms have collapsed roofs, the thermal baths are filled with debris, and nature reclaims more of the structure each year. Yet the springs still flow, their healing waters continuing their ancient journey to the surface, now witnessed only by hikers and photographers. Romania's Baile Herculane tells a similar story across an even longer timespan. According to legend, the hero Hercules bathed in these thermal springs, and Roman aristocracy used them for centuries. The town embraces this mythological connection, with a large statue of Hercules dominating its main square. The most iconic site is the now-defunct Imperial Austrian Neptune Baths, built in the 1880s. In its heyday, Neptune was considered one of Europe's most modern bath complexes, and was utilized by elite Austrian royalty. The Neptune Baths represented the pinnacle of Victorian spa architecture. Ornate tilework, soaring ceilings with skylights, separate bathing areas for men and women in perfect symmetry, and water that flowed directly from the thermal springs into beautifully designed pools. The facility could accommodate hundreds of bathers simultaneously, with private treatment rooms for medical procedures and relaxation areas where guests could rest between bathing sessions. The 20th century brought dramatic changes to Baile Herculane. World wars damaged the infrastructure. The communist era saw attempts to revive the spa town as a destination for workers rather than aristocracy, with Soviet-era hotels built in the town's southern section during the town's revival as a popular vacation spot. But these efforts couldn't sustain the level of maintenance the historic buildings required. When communism fell, tourism collapsed, and the ornate Victorian structures were too expensive to restore. The Neptune Baths were abandoned, their tiles cracking, their ornate fixtures rusting, their windows breaking one by one. Today, Baile Herculane exists in a dual state. Some modern thermal spas remain operational, while abandoned Soviet-era hotels and the historic Neptune Baths create an eerie contrast. The juxtaposition is striking. Functioning modern resorts operate within sight of magnificent ruins, demonstrating how some spa towns can partially survive while their most beautiful structures decay. Across the Atlantic, a different type of resort culture created its own collection of abandoned grand hotels. In New York's Catskill Mountains, a collection of 538 hotels and 50,000 bungalow colonies known as the Borscht Belt, or Jewish Alps, thrived from the 1920s through the 1970s. These resorts emerged from discrimination. When many American hotels posted "No Hebrew" signs in the early 20th century, Jewish families from New York City sought vacation destinations where they'd be welcome. The Catskills, accessible by train and car, became their chosen summer escape. What started as simple boarding houses evolved into massive resort complexes. Grossinger's, which would inspire the setting for the 1987 film Dirty Dancing, grew from a farmhouse opened by Austrian immigrants in 1914 into a grand destination so large it had its own airstrip and zip code, with arenas for tennis, ice skating, and skiing. It was the first resort to use artificial snow in 1952. At its peak, Grossinger's could accommodate thousands of guests in multiple hotel buildings, offered dozens of activities, and featured entertainment every night. The Concord Resort Hotel was the Borscht Belt's largest property. Known for its signature entertainment venues including the Cordelian Room, the Constellation Room, and the Imperial Room, which hosted comedians Jackie Mason and Buddy Hackett. The Concord epitomized mid-century resort excess. Enormous dining rooms serving abundant meals, multiple swimming pools, a golf course, nightclubs with famous performers, and enough activities to ensure guests never needed to leave the property. The resort's advertising promised a world of their own, and for many families it was. The Borscht Belt incubated American Jewish comedy, providing stages where young performers could develop their acts before audiences who understood their cultural references and humor. Rodney Dangerfield, Joan Rivers, Mel Brooks, and countless others honed their skills in Catskill showrooms. The rapid-fire, self-deprecating style that became known as Borscht Belt humor emerged from these mountain resort stages. By the 1970s, tourism to the area began declining. Historian John Conway attributes this to the 3 A's: air conditioning, assimilation, and airfare. Air conditioning made New York City summers bearable, reducing the need to escape urban heat. Assimilation meant Jewish families felt more comfortable at previously restricted resorts, and cheap airfare made Florida and the Caribbean accessible alternatives to the Catskills. The Concord Resort Hotel closed due to bankruptcy in 1998. Grossinger's closed in 1986, a year before Dirty Dancing premiered. Too late for the film's success to save it. Today, most Borscht Belt resorts stand abandoned or demolished. In August 2022, what remained of Grossinger's main buildings was destroyed by fire, ending decades of abandonment and decay. Photographer Marissa Schoenfeld has documented these ruins extensively, capturing haunting images of indoor pools filled with debris, grand ballrooms with collapsed stages, Olympic-sized swimming pools cracked and empty, and once elegant dining rooms where nature reclaims the space. Her photographs show emerald moss carpeting what were once polished dance floors, trees growing through roofs, and graffiti covering walls that once displayed photographs of celebrity guests. The emotional weight of these abandoned resorts differs from mining ghost towns or failed utopias. These places were explicitly designed for joy, for families to make happy memories, for teenagers to fall in love, for comedians to make people laugh, for children to learn to swim. The ruins feel like the abandonment of happiness itself. Walking through them, you can almost hear echoes of splash sounds from pools, music from orchestras, laughter from nightclub audiences, and the din of hundreds of people talking over meals. The silence that replaced that joy feels particularly profound. Long before modern ghost towns emerged from industrial failure, ancient cities and trading posts were being abandoned due to shifting trade routes, political changes, and cultural upheaval. These older ghost towns often feature different architectural styles and speak to different historical contexts, but their abandonment follows familiar patterns. When the reason for existence disappears, so do the people. Grand Bassam, located on the coast of Côte d'Ivoire, served as the French colonial capital from 1893 to 1896. The town was carefully planned with colonial architecture, administrative buildings, and infrastructure meant to project French power and permanence in West Africa. Wide boulevards, impressive government buildings, and elegant residences demonstrated colonial ambition. The port handled trade with France and served as the administrative center for French West Africa's eastern region. But Grand Bassam had a fatal flaw: yellow fever. The disease ravaged the population repeatedly, killing colonists and African residents alike. After a particularly severe epidemic in 1899, French authorities decided the location was too unhealthy to serve as capital. They relocated the administrative center to Bingerville and later to Abidjan. Grand Bassam's importance evaporated overnight. The grand colonial buildings emptied. The port's trade moved elsewhere. The town that was meant to be a permanent French presence became a backwater. Today, Grand Bassam exists in a dual state. Part of the town remains inhabited, a living community where people conduct ordinary business. But the colonial district stands largely abandoned, its impressive buildings slowly deteriorating in the tropical climate. The former governor's palace, once the center of French authority, is now a crumbling ruin. The old post office, the Central African Bank building, and numerous colonial residences stand empty, their facades weathered, their interiors open to the elements. UNESCO designated Grand Bassam a World Heritage Site in 2012, recognizing the colonial architecture's historical significance while acknowledging the district's eerie emptiness. Walking through Grand Bassam's ghost district creates a strange experience. You're simultaneously in an active town and an abandoned one. Local residents go about their daily lives in newer areas while the colonial buildings decay nearby, a physical manifestation of how colonial power was both imposing and temporary. How the infrastructure meant to project permanence ultimately became just another set of ruins. The Silk Road contains numerous ghost cities that once thrived as trading posts. Merv, in modern Turkmenistan, was one of the world's largest cities in the 12th century, with perhaps 200,000 inhabitants. The city sat at the crossroads of trade routes connecting east and west, and its markets sold goods from China, India, Persia, and Europe. Merv's wealth supported impressive architecture, sophisticated irrigation systems, and a vibrant cultural life. Then came the Mongol invasion of 1221. Genghis Khan's armies destroyed the city so thoroughly that it never fully recovered. Though attempts at rebuilding occurred, Merv never regained its former significance. Today, the site is an archaeological zone where ruined structures stretch across the desert. A once great city reduced to foundations and fragments. Chingti, Mauritania, offers another example of a former trading center declined into near abandonment. Founded in the 13th century, Chingti became a major stop on trans-Saharan trade routes. The town was renowned for its libraries containing ancient Islamic manuscripts and served as a gathering point for pilgrims heading to Mecca. At its peak, Chingti was effectively a desert city, a sophisticated urban center in an unlikely location, sustained entirely by trade. As trade routes shifted and political control changed, Chingti's importance declined. The population shrank dramatically. Sand dunes encroached on the town, burying parts of it entirely. Today, Chingti has only a few hundred permanent residents. The old city center, with its distinctive stone architecture and narrow streets, is partially buried by sand. The famous libraries remain, carefully maintained by scholars determined to preserve the manuscript collections, but much of Chingti feels frozen. A medieval trading post somehow surviving into the 21st century, but clearly past its prime. These colonial and trading post ghost towns differ from industrial and mining towns in their timeframes and architecture. They're older, their abandonment more gradual, their ruins often more substantial. Stone construction has lasted better than the wooden buildings of Western mining towns, but the underlying story remains similar. When the economic or political reason for a settlement's existence disappears, the settlement itself usually follows. The 21st century continues creating ghost towns, though the mechanisms and meanings have evolved. Today's abandoned places often reflect new types of failure: speculative real estate bubbles, climate change, economic globalization. And their emptiness carries different implications than the ghost towns of previous eras. China's ghost cities represent an unprecedented phenomenon in urban planning gone wrong. In the 1990s and 2000s, Chinese local governments and developers built entire cities in anticipation of urbanization and population growth. These weren't small towns, but complete urban environments designed for hundreds of thousands of residents. High-rise apartment complexes, shopping centers, schools, government buildings, and infrastructure all constructed simultaneously. The problem was that people didn't come. The cities offered housing, but not jobs. They had buildings, but not communities. Some, like Ordo's Kangbashi, were built in remote locations far from existing population centers. The result was vast urban landscapes that look occupied from a distance, but are functionally empty. Streetlights illuminate roads without traffic. Apartment towers stand with few lights in their windows. Shopping centers contain stores that never opened. Parks feature elaborate landscaping with no one to enjoy them. These Chinese ghost cities are eerie precisely because they're new and modern. Unlike the weathered decay of old ghost towns, these places look contemporary, as if everyone just left yesterday. The construction quality is often poor, so even brand new buildings already show signs of deterioration. The scale is vast. You can drive for miles through neighborhoods of empty high-rises, experiencing the surreal feeling of being in a city designed for millions, but inhabited by thousands. Some Chinese ghost cities have gradually filled in as populations did eventually arrive, though at much slower rates than anticipated. Others remain largely empty years after construction, monuments to overconfident planning and speculative excess. They represent a uniquely modern form of abandonment. Not buildings emptied by disaster or economic collapse, but places built speculatively and never fully occupied in the first place. The American Rust Belt contains numerous neighborhoods and even entire suburbs approaching ghost town status. Detroit's population peaked at 1.8 million in 1950 and has declined to less than 700,000 today. Entire neighborhoods have emptied as jobs disappeared and residents moved elsewhere. Blocks of homes stand abandoned, their windows broken, their yards overgrown. Some neighborhoods have been demolished, returning urban land to grass and weeds. Other structures remain in a state of arrested decay. Not quite ruins, not quite salvageable, existing in limbo while their futures are debated. What makes these Rust Belt ghost neighborhoods particularly significant is that they're occurring within living cities. Detroit hasn't been completely abandoned. It maintains city services, has active neighborhoods, and shows signs of revival in some districts. But large sections of the city are essentially ghost towns within city limits, creating a patchwork landscape of occupied and abandoned areas. This pattern differs from historic ghost towns that emptied completely and can't be fully understood through traditional ghost town frameworks. Climate change threatens to create new ghost towns globally. Low-lying island nations face eventual submersion as sea levels rise. Coastal communities from Bangladesh to Louisiana experience increasing flooding and erosion. Drought-stricken regions see populations decline as water becomes scarce and agriculture fails. Some scientists predict that within decades, parts of currently inhabited regions will become effectively uninhabitable due to extreme heat, water scarcity, or sea level rise. The potential scale of climate-driven abandonment dwarfs historical ghost town formation. We're not talking about individual mining towns or even single cities, but potentially entire regions where human habitation becomes unsustainable. The ghost towns of the future may include major urban centers that seem permanent today, but will become untenable as environmental conditions change. Shopping malls represent another modern ghost town phenomenon. As retail shifts online and consumer habits change, malls across America and globally are closing. These weren't just retail spaces, but community gathering places. Sites of teenage socialization, holiday shopping traditions, and indoor walking exercise. Dead malls create particularly eerie environments. The vast interior spaces, designed to feel alive and vibrant with shoppers, become oppressive when empty. Stores behind security gates, silent fountains, vacant food courts, and empty parking lots create spaces that feel wrong, like stage sets after the performance has ended. Some dead malls are demolished and redeveloped. Others linger in partial operation, with a few stores remaining while most spaces sit vacant. Still others are completely abandoned, becoming destinations for urban explorers and photographers. These mall ruins speak to changing economic patterns and consumption habits. They're monuments to a particular era of American capitalism and social life, an era that's clearly ending. The ghost towns of the 21st century. Chinese ghost cities, Rust Belt neighborhoods, dying malls, climate-threatened communities, differ from historical ghost towns in their modernity and scale. They're not romantic ruins in remote locations, but contemporary failures in familiar landscapes. They challenge us to think about what makes communities sustainable, what happens when speculation outpaces reality, and how we'll adapt to environmental changes that make current living patterns unsustainable. Tonight, we've walked together through empty streets and silent buildings across continents and centuries. These ghost towns remind us that all prosperity is temporary, that nature patiently reclaims everything we build, and that the places we consider permanent may prove more ephemeral than we imagine. They're monuments to dreams pursued and abandoned, to disasters survived and not survived, to economic forces beyond individual control, and to the simple reality that settlements exist only as long as people have reasons to stay. The silence of ghost towns speaks louder than the noise of thriving cities, offering perspectives on what matters and what endures. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the world's forgotten places. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may you find meaning in impermanence, peace in the knowledge that all things change, and comfort in the understanding that even when places are abandoned, their stories are never truly forgotten.